The man had been there so long that most people no longer saw him. He sat near the edge of the sidewalk, where the concrete met the worn bricks of an old plaza, a place commuters crossed every day without thinking twice, eyes fixed on phones or schedules, minds already somewhere else. He was an old black man with a back slightly curved by time, hair silvered and thin beneath a faded cap, clothes clean but clearly worn, as if they had been repaired more times than replaced. He moved slowly, deliberately, carrying himself with a quiet dignity that did not ask for attention and therefore rarely received it. People passed within inches of him, stepping around as though he were part of the street itself. Another fixture like the lamppost or the trash bin, present but unacknowledged. He had learned not to take it personally, at least not anymore. Years ago, each ignored glance had carried a sting, a reminder of how easily someone could disappear in plain sight. Over time, that sting dulled into something quieter, a steady awareness that invisibility came with age, with poverty, with skin that had weathered decades of unkind assumptions. He sat there most mornings before the city fully woke up, watching delivery trucks roll past, listening to distant horns and footsteps echoing off storefront windows. Sometimes he nodded to himself, not in conversation but in rhythm with the city's pulse, as if he were keeping time with something only he could hear. People made assumptions about him without meaning to. Some thought he was homeless. Others assumed he was asking for money, even though he rarely did. A few glanced at the battered piano bench beside him and wondered briefly why it was there, before deciding it was none of their concern. That was how most interactions with him ended, with a quick decision not to engage. He understood that too. The world moved fast, and slowing down required intention. Intention was in short supply. He remembered a time when being seen had been unavoidable, when rooms turned quiet the moment he entered them, not out of fear or dismissal, but anticipation. Back then, people leaned forward, not away. But those memories stayed tucked away now, folded neatly where no one else could reach them, because explaining a life that had already passed felt unnecessary. He did not carry photographs or clippings. He did not correct anyone's assumptions. He let the present version of himself exist without footnotes, even if it meant being misunderstood. The plaza itself had changed over the years, stores coming and going, names replaced, paint refreshed, but he remained, anchored to that corner by habit and something deeper than routine. He liked the way the morning light fell across the pavement there, how it warmed his hands when the air was still cold. He liked the acoustics too, though no one else noticed them. The way sound lingered just a moment longer between the buildings. Sometimes he closed his eyes and listened, cataloging the tones of the city the way a musician might, separating footsteps from engines, whine from voices, finding patterns in what others dismissed as noise. There was a piano nearby now, upright and scarred, its wood chipped and keys yellowed with age, placed there weeks earlier as part of some public art project. No one remembered to explain properly. People treated it like a curiosity, tapping a few keys in passing, laughing at the sour notes, then moving on. To him, it was different. It was an invitation that stirred something long dormant, something he had learned to keep quiet. He had not touched it yet, not openly. He waited, watched, listened, as if making sure it was real, as if approaching too quickly might break the fragile permission he felt it offered. Most days, no one noticed the way his fingers hovered near the keys when the plaza emptied, or how his posture shifted slightly whenever someone else played, his head tilting unconsciously toward the sound. They did not see the familiarity in his gaze or the discipline in how he sat, because those details required attention, and attention was what he had stopped expecting. To everyone else, he was just another old man resting on a bench, another face to pass without remembering. But beneath that quiet exterior was a lifetime of sound, of stages and rehearsal rooms, of nights when applause filled the air, and mornings when silence felt earned rather than imposed. That history did not announce itself. It waited patiently, like the piano beside him, for a moment when the world might finally slow down enough to listen. 2. The piano did not belong there, not really, and that was part of what made it easy to ignore. It stood slightly off-center in the plaza, angled awkwardly, as if whoever had placed it there hadn't fully committed to the idea. Its once polished surface dulled by weather and fingerprints, its legs scuffed from being dragged across concrete. A small sign taped to the side announced that it was for public use, an invitation most people read and then dismissed with a smile before moving on. Children banged on the keys when their parents weren't looking. Office workers pressed a few notes in passing, laughing at the uneven sound, and street performers occasionally claimed it briefly before wandering elsewhere. To most, it was a novelty, something to acknowledge for a moment before returning to the urgency of their day. To him, it was something else entirely. He noticed it the first morning it appeared, registering its presence the way one musician recognizes another, immediately aware of its imperfections and potential. He watched people approach it hesitantly, their movements unsure, fingers stiff, producing fragments of melodies that never quite settled into shape. Each time someone played, he listened closely, not judging, simply absorbing, because sound had always been his way of understanding the world. When the plaza emptied again and the echoes faded, he felt a pull toward the instrument that surprised him with its intensity. It had been years since he'd allowed himself to feel that pull openly. He approached the piano slowly, not out of fear, but respect, as though greeting an old friend after a long separation. His hand hovered over the keys for a moment, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his palm, tracing the edge where countless fingers had rested before. The keys themselves were uneven, some slightly lower than others, ivory chipped at the corners, but to him that imperfection was familiar. He had played instruments like this before, pianos that had lived long lives, that carried stories in their wear. He tested a single note softly, then another, listening not just to pitch, but to resonance, to how the sound bounced between the buildings and returned altered but intact. When he sat down fully, something in his posture shifted. His back straightened just enough, his shoulders relaxed, and his hands settled into position without hesitation, fingers curved naturally, wrists loose. This was not the tentative movement of someone experimenting for the first time, but the muscle memory of someone returning to a language they had never truly forgotten. The first phrase he played was quiet, almost tentative, as if he were checking whether the piano would respond, whether the space would allow the music to exist without interruption. When it did, he continued, letting the melody unfold gradually, unhurried, shaped by breath rather than tempo. People passing by slowed without realizing why. A few glanced over their shoulders, puzzled by the sound, because it didn't fit the usual noise of the plaza. It wasn't loud or demanding, but it carried intention, a coherence that made it stand out against the background hum of the city. The man played as though no one were watching, eyes half closed, expression calm, fully present in the moment he had entered. He adjusted to the piano's quirks instinctively, compensating for sticky keys, coaxing warmth from strings that hadn't been tuned in far too long. He did not play for applause. He played because the instrument was there, because the space allowed it, because the music needed somewhere to go. Each note felt like a conversation resumed after years of silence, familiar and strange at once. He did not rush toward recognizable melodies or flashy passages. Instead, he let the music breathe, weaving something reflective and grounded, something that carried both sorrow and resilience without leaning too heavily on either. As he played, memories surfaced uninvited, not as images but as sensations, the weight of keys beneath his fingers, the balance of his body on the bench, the way sound filled a room when played with intention. He let those memories pass through him without clinging to them, focusing instead on the present, on the way the plaza responded to the music, how footsteps slowed, how conversations dropped to murmurs. He was aware, dimly, that people were gathering now, that the piano no longer sat unnoticed, but that awareness stayed at the edges of his mind. For the first time in a long while, he did not feel like part of the street's scenery. He felt aligned with it, as though the city itself were listening, holding still just long enough to receive what he was offering. The piano that hadn't belonged there suddenly made sense, not as decoration or novelty, but as a vessel, waiting patiently for someone who knew how to speak through it. 3. Music has a way of bending time, and as his fingers moved across the keys, the plaza began to change without anyone consciously deciding it should. The rush that usually defined the space softened first, footsteps slowing, then stopping altogether, conversations trailing off mid-sentence as people turned toward the sound. What reached them was not a song they recognized immediately, not something packaged for familiarity or comfort, but something deeper, a current of feeling that slipped past defenses and settled somewhere quiet inside. The melody carried patience, confidence without urgency, and it asked nothing from the listener except attention. A woman who had been walking briskly toward the subway entrance paused near the edge of the crowd, her phone still raised in her hand, forgotten. A delivery driver leaned against his truck longer than necessary, arms crossed, eyes closed for a moment, as if grounding himself before the next stop. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, sensing that something unusual was happening, and even those who tried to keep moving found their pace disrupted, their bodies responding before their minds caught up. The music did not demand silence, yet silence emerged naturally around it, a shared instinct to make space for something that felt important. He played with an ease that suggested trust, not just in his own ability, but in the music itself. Notes flowed into one another seamlessly, each phrase resolving just enough to invite the next, and the imperfections of the piano became part of the expression rather than obstacles to overcome. When a key stuck briefly, he adjusted without breaking rhythm. When a string rang sharper than expected, he leaned into it, allowing the sound to color the phrase rather than fight it. Those listening could sense that this was not improvisation born of uncertainty, but adaptation born of experience. As the crowd grew, no one announced it. There was no applause between passages, no calling out, only the gradual accumulation of bodies drawn by the same inexplicable pull. People stood shoulder to shoulder now, strangers sharing a moment without acknowledging one another, eyes fixed on the man at the piano. Some recorded quietly, holding their phones low, as if aware that capturing the moment too aggressively might break it. Others simply listened, hands in pockets, expressions softened by something they hadn't expected to feel on an ordinary day. The music itself seemed to hold memory, though not in a way that required listeners to know its source. It carried echoes of joy tempered by loss, of endurance shaped by time, of nights when sound was both refuge and declaration. Even those with no musical training could feel the structure beneath it, the discipline guiding each movement, the intention behind every pause. It was the kind of playing that revealed itself gradually, rewarding patience rather than demanding reaction. And as minutes passed, the plaza became something closer to a listening room than a thoroughfare. He remained focused, gaze lowered, breathing steady, aware of the people now gathered but not altered by them. This was not performance in the traditional sense. There was no bow, no acknowledgement of the audience, no visible effort to impress. It felt instead like an offering, something shared freely and without expectation. The city, so often loud and impatient, responded by leaning in, holding itself still in small but noticeable ways. A man near the back wiped at his eyes quickly, embarrassed by the emotion he hadn't anticipated. A young woman closed her eyes entirely, letting the sound wash over her, her shoulders easing as if releasing a tension she'd been carrying for far too long. The music did not tell a single story, yet it seemed to meet each listener where they were, reflecting back something personal and familiar without naming it. That was its power, not in spectacle, but in resonance. When the final notes of the piece faded, he did not lift his hands immediately. He let the sound linger, allowing the plaza to absorb the silence that followed, a silence different from the one before he began to play. This silence was full, charged with shared experience, and no one rushed to fill it. For a brief moment, the city held its breath, suspended between what had been offered and what might come next. And in that stillness, it became clear that something had shifted, that this was no longer just an old man at the street piano, but the beginning of a moment that would travel far beyond this plaza, carried forward by everyone who had stopped long enough to truly listen. 4. What the camera didn't know was everything that lived behind the calm in his posture and the certainty in his hands, the years compressed into muscle memory and instinct that no lens could capture fully. As people gathered, some quietly raising their phones to record, they framed him as a moment, a surprise, an anomaly in the flow of the day, without realizing how much history sat just beneath the surface of that image. The camera saw an old black man playing a piano in the street. It could not see the rooms he had filled decades earlier, the discipline that shaped each movement, or the sacrifices that had taught him to play not just for applause, but for survival. Inside him, the act of playing reopened doors he rarely approached anymore. Each phrase carried echoes of long nights spent practicing until his fingers ached, of teachers who demanded precision and offered little praise, of stages where mistakes were unforgiving and excellence was the only acceptable currency. He remembered learning early that talent alone was not enough, that he had to be undeniable in a world that often questioned his presence before it questioned his ability. That lesson had shaped him deeply, instilling a work ethic so ingrained that even now, sitting at a battered street piano, his standards had not softened. He played as if the room still mattered, because to him it always did. He thought about the years when music had been everything, when his days revolved around rehearsals and performances, when his name appeared in programs and on marquees that promised something special. He had known recognition, had felt the rush of being truly heard, and he had also known how fragile that recognition could be. Opportunities came and went, often determined by forces far removed from talent or effort, and he had learned to navigate a landscape where doors opened unevenly and closed without explanation. Over time, the strain of that navigation took its toll, not just professionally, but personally, shaping choices that led him away from the spotlight and toward a quieter life. The camera could not capture the grief folded into his playing, the losses that had changed his relationship with music from ambition to solace. There were people he no longer played for because they were no longer there to listen, moments when music became a way to speak to absence rather than presence. Those experiences softened his sound without weakening it, adding depth to every note that listeners felt without understanding why. What sounded to them like beauty carried layers of endurance, of learning how to continue when the future no longer looked like it once had. As he played, he was aware of being watched, but he did not perform for the gaze. He had learned long ago how easily attention could distort intention, how quickly art could become spectacle. This moment was different. He played because the piano was there, and because the music still lived in him, not because someone might notice or record it. The presence of cameras hovered at the edge of his awareness, like distant noise, acknowledged but not engaged. He had outlived the need to prove himself, and that freedom infused his playing with a sincerity that no algorithm could manufacture. He adjusted his tempo slightly, responding to the space, to the way sound carried and returned altered by the open air. That sensitivity came from years of reading rooms, of understanding acoustics and audiences intuitively, and it allowed him to connect with listeners even without words. The camera might catch his hands moving fluidly, might zoom in on the lines of his face etched by time, but it would miss the decisions happening in real time, the constant listening and adjusting that defined true musicianship. When the piece ended and the crowd held its silence, he felt the familiar mix of relief and vulnerability that followed every performance, no matter how informal. The camera froze that moment into a clip that could be replayed and shared, but it could not carry the full weight of what had just occurred. The convergence of a lifetime of experience with a chance encounter in a public space. What the camera didn't know, and could never fully know, was that this was not a rediscovery of talent, but a continuation of it. A reminder that artistry did not disappear when the spotlight moved on. It simply learned to exist where it was least expected, waiting patiently for ears willing to listen. 5. The life he never spoke about had unfolded far from sidewalks and street corners, shaped by ambition, discipline, and barriers that demanded resilience long before the world had language for acknowledging them. He grew up in a house where music was not a hobby but a necessity, where a battered upright piano sat against the living room wall like a promise and a challenge all at once. His mother believed in structure, in the power of routine, and she insisted he practice even when neighborhood noise pressed against the windows and distractions pulled at him from every direction. His father, quieter, worked long hours and listened intently when the house finally settled at night, nodding approval, not with words, but with presence. From an early age, he learned that excellence was not optional, it was armor, something he would need to carry with him into spaces that were not built to welcome him. By his teenage years, his talent was undeniable. Teachers recognized it quickly, some encouraging him with genuine belief, others with a cautious admiration that never quite translated into opportunity. He won local competitions, earned scholarships, and found himself stepping into conservatories where he was often the only black face in the room. There, the expectations doubled. He practiced longer, listened harder, and absorbed criticism with a composure that masked how deeply it cut. He understood even then that mistakes would be remembered longer for him than for others, that he would be judged not just on performance, but on whether he seemed to belong. That awareness sharpened his focus, but also weighed on him, planting a quiet exhaustion that would follow him for years. His early career held promise and contradiction in equal measure. He performed in respected halls, collaborated with musicians whose names carried weight, and tasted the kind of recognition that suggested a long future ahead. Yet alongside those moments were doors that closed without explanation, contracts that evaporated, and subtle signals that his presence unsettled expectations. He was praised for his expressiveness, then cautioned to be more restrained. He was celebrated for originality, then urged to conform. Navigating those contradictions required constant adjustment, and over time, the joy of creation became entangled with the labor of survival. There were also personal losses that reshaped his relationship with music in ways few ever saw. He loved deeply, committed to relationships with the same intensity he brought to his art, and when those relationships fractured under the strain of instability and long absences, the pain cut into him quietly. Music became both refuge and reminder, a place where he could process grief without explanation. As years passed, he found himself choosing stability over uncertainty, stepping away from the relentless pursuit of stages and toward work that paid the bills but asked him to leave pieces of himself behind. The decision was not dramatic. It unfolded gradually, each compromise justified by necessity, until the life he once envisioned felt distant, almost unreal. He did not speak about these choices because he did not frame them as tragedy. They were survival, shaped by context and responsibility, by a world that rarely made space for sustained success without sacrifice. He continued to play privately, in small rooms, at gatherings where music mattered more than reputation, keeping the flame alive even as public recognition faded. Over time, even those spaces grew fewer, and the piano became something he returned to alone, a conversation carried out without witnesses. When he found himself in the plaza, years later, sitting beside a public piano with nothing to prove and no one to impress, that history traveled with him silently. The life he never spoke about was not lost. It was layered, embedded in every choice he made at the keyboard, in the patience of his tempo and the restraint of his phrasing. Those who listened felt its weight without knowing its source, responding to something authentic and earned. They saw an old man playing beautifully and wondered how such talent could exist unnoticed. What they did not realize was that it had never disappeared. It had simply lived through decades of complexity, shaped by perseverance rather than applause, waiting for a moment when the world might finally be ready to hear it again. 6. The video that changed everything began as an afterthought, a simple decision made by someone standing near the back of the crowd who felt an unshakable urge to hold on to what they were witnessing. They didn't announce themselves or move closer, didn't frame the shot carefully or adjust settings for perfection. They simply lifted their phone and pressed record, capturing the old man's hands as they moved across the keys with an ease that felt almost unreal in the open air. At first, the recording was meant for personal memory, something to revisit later as proof that moments like this could still exist in the middle of a rushed day. But as the music continued and the crowd held its collective stillness, the person recording sensed that this was bigger than a private keepsake. The clip was less than 3 minutes long, unedited and imperfect, wind brushing faintly against the microphone, a passerby coughing somewhere off frame, yet the imperfections only made it feel more real. When the final notes faded and the man remained seated, hands resting lightly on the keys, the person recording stopped the video without applause or commentary. They stood there for a moment, unsure what to do next, then slipped the phone back into their pocket and joined the quiet dispersal of the crowd as the plaza slowly returned to its usual rhythm. At the time, nothing about the act felt consequential. It was just another video among thousands captured every minute, another digital fragment destined to blend into the endless scroll. That evening, the video was uploaded almost casually, shared with a brief caption that said little more than what was visible: an old man playing piano in the street, something beautiful witnessed by chance. There was no attempt to sensationalize it, no hashtags chosen strategically, no call to action. It was shared because the person who posted it felt changed by what they had heard and wanted to pass that feeling along, trusting that others might recognize it too. Within minutes, a handful of likes appeared, then a few comments, people expressing surprise, appreciation, curiosity. It was easy to assume that would be the extent of it. By morning, the video had traveled farther than anyone expected. Overnight, it had been shared and reshared, moving across platforms and time zones, carried by people who felt compelled to show it to someone else. Messages piled up beneath it, strangers asking who he was, where he was from, why they had never heard of him before. Some commented on the technical brilliance of his playing, others on the emotion it stirred, still others on the injustice of such talent being overlooked. The algorithm did what algorithms do, amplifying engagement without context, pushing the video into feeds far removed from the plaza where it had been filmed. News outlets took notice quickly, drawn by the simplicity of the story and the response it generated. Producers searched for the source of the clip. Reporters reached out to the person who had posted it, asking for details they didn't have. The old man himself remained unaware of the storm gathering around his image, spending the morning as he usually did, moving through his routine without checking social media or scanning headlines. While his face appeared on screens across the country, he sat quietly with a cup of coffee, unaware that the world had decided to pause for him at last. As the video spread, people began connecting dots, recognizing mannerisms, recalling performances from years past, whispering his name in comment threads that grew faster than they could be followed. Musicians shared it with reverence. Critics dissected it with admiration, and everyday viewers felt a collective sense of wonder mixed with regret, asking how someone like this could have been missed. The clip became more than a moment. It became a mirror, reflecting questions about value, visibility, and how easily society overlooks depth in favor of immediacy. By the time he returned to the plaza the next day, unaware of what awaited him, the video had already changed the narrative. It had taken a quiet act of music and transformed it into a conversation the world could not ignore. What began as an unplanned recording had become a catalyst, lifting a life shaped by patience and perseverance into the glare of public attention once more. And as cameras and microphones prepared to descend on the place where it all began, the old man remained the same, carrying his history with humility, unaware that his face, his hands, and his music were about to be recognized everywhere, reshaping his story in ways no one could have predicted. 7. Recognition came with a strange delay, as if the world needed time to reconcile what it was seeing with what it had failed to notice for so long. By mid-morning, musicians and long-time listeners began leaving comments that shifted the tone of the conversation entirely. They spoke with certainty rather than surprise, naming techniques, phrasing, and stylistic choices that marked the playing as something cultivated through years of serious study. Some mentioned performances they have remembered from decades earlier, concerts attended when they were younger, names printed on programs now yellowed with age. At first, these comments seemed like nostalgia speaking louder than fact, but as more people added fragments of memory, a clearer picture began to form, one that contradicted the narrative of sudden discovery the video had inspired. Within hours, Journalists and producers began digging deeper, cross-referencing those names with archives, searching databases that had not been touched in years. Old recordings surfaced, grainy audio files and concert footage preserved by enthusiasts who never stopped believing his work mattered. Articles written long ago were rediscovered, reviews that praised his depth and restraint, interviews that hinted at a career shaped as much by barriers as by talent. The realization landed slowly but heavily. This was not an unknown man plucked from obscurity by chance, but an artist whose recognition had been interrupted, delayed by circumstances that extended far beyond the quality of his work. As this understanding spread, the tone of the public response shifted from wonder to reckoning. People expressed admiration alongside discomfort, asking how someone with such a history could have been reduced to a fleeting street-side curiosity. Musicians spoke openly about the patterns they recognized, how often brilliance from certain voices was celebrated briefly and then sidelined when it failed to fit expectations. Listeners who had shared the video for its beauty now shared it again for its context, determined that the story behind the music should be heard as clearly as the notes themselves. He, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of this evolving narrative. When acquaintances finally reached out, their voices animated and urgent, he listened patiently, struggling to understand the scale of what they were describing. New segments, articles, interviews, all unfolding at once, all centered on a moment that had felt ordinary to him when it happened. The idea that recognition had arrived too late did not register immediately. He did not frame his life in terms of what the world owed him, only in terms of what he had lived and what he still carried forward. By the time he learned that his name was trending, that producers wanted interviews and audiences wanted explanations, he felt a mixture of surprise and detachment. The attention did not fill a void so much as illuminate one he had learned to live around. He accepted the recognition with humility, not because it meant nothing, but because he understood its fragility. Fame, he knew, could arrive suddenly and disappear just as quickly, and he had already lived through its absence. What mattered more was the shift he sensed beneath the surface, a collective acknowledgement that something valuable had been overlooked, and that overlooking it had consequences. Recognition coming too late carried its own weight. It arrived without the urgency of ambition, without the hunger that once drove him forward, and instead settled into a quieter space shaped by reflection. People apologized in comment threads, in interviews, in messages sent to him directly, expressing regret not for what they personally had done, but for what the system had allowed. He listened to those apologies with grace, understanding that blame was less important than awareness. The music had done what words often fail to do. It had slowed people down long enough to notice, to question, and to remember. As the day unfolded, the narrative surrounding him continued to deepen. He was no longer framed simply as an old man playing piano in the street, but as a reminder of how talent could endure even when recognition did not. The story forced listeners to confront their own assumptions about age, visibility, and worth, challenging the idea that greatness always announced itself loudly or arrived on schedule. In that sense, the recognition, however delayed, became meaningful not as validation, but as a catalyst for reflection. It asked a harder question than admiration alone ever could. How many other lives like his were still being walked past, unheard and unseen, waiting patiently for the world to slow down long enough to listen? 8. The news found him the way news often did now, not through knocking on doors or official announcements, but through the sudden presence of cameras where there had once only been passing faces. By the time he returned to the plaza the next morning, the space felt altered, charged with anticipation rather than indifference. Vans lined the street edges, logos stamped boldly on their sides, cables snaking across the pavement as crews hurried to set up before he even realized why they were there. Microphones were tested, lenses adjusted, voices lowered when they noticed him approaching, as if everyone sensed that something fragile was unfolding and didn't want to disturb it too abruptly. He paused when he saw them, confusion crossing his face for the first time since this all began. The familiar bench, the piano, the usual rhythm of the plaza had been replaced by a tension so dense it felt physical. A producer approached him gently, introducing herself, explaining who she was and why they were there, words tumbling over one another in an effort to be both professional and kind. He listened quietly, nodding, absorbing the information without reacting outwardly, because reacting had never been his instinct. Years of navigating unpredictable systems had taught him to wait, to understand before responding. As interviews began, he was guided to a chair near the piano, the instrument positioned carefully within frame, as if it were a character itself. Reporters asked him about the moment that sparked everything, about how it felt to suddenly be seen, about the years that had led him here. He answered simply, choosing words that reflected gratitude rather than bitterness, because bitterness had never helped him survive. When asked why he had been playing there that day, he smiled faintly and said the piano was there, and so was he. The simplicity of the answer disarmed those listening, revealing a humility that contrasted sharply with the magnitude of the attention now surrounding him. Broadcasts aired throughout the day, his face appearing on screens in homes, offices, and waiting rooms, his hands replayed in slow motion as commentators marveled at their grace. Headlines framed him as a rediscovered genius, a hidden talent finally brought to light. And while the language carried admiration, it also carried an unspoken discomfort. Viewers sensed that this story was not just about music, but about timing, about recognition delayed by forces rarely named outright. The old man watched none of it. He did not own a television, and even if he had, he preferred the immediacy of lived experience to its mediated reflection. Between interviews, he sat quietly, hands folded, listening as producers discussed schedules and segments around him as if he were not there. The irony was not lost on him. Being seen so intensely while still feeling slightly invisible within the machinery of coverage felt familiar, a reminder that attention did not always equal understanding. Yet there were moments of genuine connection too. Reporters who asked thoughtful questions, technicians who paused to thank him personally, listeners who approached respectfully, sharing how the music had reached them in ways they hadn't expected. Those moments mattered more to him than the cameras themselves. As the day wore on, offers began to surface, invitations to perform, to record, to tell his story in formats larger than he had ever imagined. He received them politely, without commitment, aware that urgency often belonged more to those offering than to those receiving. The news cycle moved quickly, and he understood that interest could fade as rapidly as it had arrived. What lingered for him was not the promise of renewed fame, but the realization that the music had done what it was meant to do. It had connected, opened space, and reminded people to listen. When the crews finally packed up and the plaza returned to something resembling its usual self, he remained seated for a while longer, letting the quiet settle back in. The piano was still there, unchanged by its sudden prominence, keys still chipped, sound still imperfect. He placed his hands on it once more, not for the cameras, not for the headlines, but for himself. The notes drifted out into the open air again, softer now, almost private, a continuation rather than a performance. The news had found him, but it did not define him. He was still the same man who had sat there the day before, carrying a lifetime of music within him, playing not because the world was watching, but because the world, at last, was listening. 9. The world apologized in 1,000 different voices, all at once, and the sound of it was overwhelming in a way he had not expected. Messages poured in from strangers across continents, people who felt compelled to say something, anything, after seeing his face and hearing his music. Some wrote long letters describing where they had been when they first watched the video, how it made them stop mid-task, how it stirred memories of their own parents or grandparents, how it reminded them of dreams deferred and talents overlooked. Others kept it simple, offering a quiet apology for walking past people like him without seeing them, for assuming that age or circumstance told the whole story. He read some of these messages slowly, carefully, then set them aside, aware that no response he could offer would fully meet the weight of what was being expressed. Communities responded too, not just online, but in tangible ways. Musicians organized small tributes, playing his pieces or improvising in his honor, framing his story as a reminder of the endurance of artistry beyond recognition. Churches mentioned him in sermons, speaking about humility and the danger of overlooking wisdom that arrived without fanfare. Schools shared his video in classrooms, using it to spark conversations about history, resilience, and the systems that shaped opportunity unevenly. Each response carried sincerity, but also an undercurrent of regret, a sense that something important had been missed for far too long. Offers arrived alongside apologies, some thoughtful, others hurried. Recording labels reached out, eager to capture the sound that had moved millions, while concert halls proposed performances framed as homecomings or overdue recognitions. Patrons offered financial support, scholarships in his name, grants meant to honor what he had given without receiving. He listened to these proposals with the same calm he brought to the piano, understanding that generosity often surged in moments like this, fueled by emotion and attention. He accepted. Some helped quietly, declined, others without explanation, guided not by pride, but by an instinct honed through years of navigating promises that did not always endure. The apologies themselves stirred complex emotions. He did not resent them, but he did not cling to them either. Apology implied wrongdoing, and while the world's regret felt sincere, he understood that responsibility was diffuse, spread across decades and systems rather than individuals. People wanted absolution as much as they wanted to express remorse, and he could not grant that, not because he lacked compassion, but because his life was not a ledger to be balanced. He accepted the words as gestures of awareness, hoping they would translate into lasting attention for others still unseen, rather than closing the chapter too neatly on his own story. As recognition grew, so did reflection. Commentators began to speak openly about why his talent had not been celebrated continuously, naming race, age, and access as forces that shaped whose brilliance was nurtured and whose was sidelined. These conversations mattered to him more than the accolades because they acknowledged realities he had lived quietly for years. Hearing them discussed publicly did not heal old wounds, but it affirmed that his experiences were not isolated, that they were part of a larger pattern finally being addressed. He found himself thinking often about the piano in the plaza, about how easily the moment might have passed without notice if no one had slowed down to listen. The apologies, the tributes, the offers, all traced back to that simple act of attention. He hoped that lesson would endure beyond the news cycle, that people might pause more often, listen more deeply, and question their assumptions before moving on. In accepting the world's apology, he did so without ceremony, without demanding recompense or explanation. He continued to play, sometimes in larger spaces now, sometimes in quiet corners that felt more like home. The music remained his constant, unchanged by recognition, carrying the same depth it always had. The world had spoken its regret, and he had heard it, but what mattered most was what followed, whether the listening would last, and whether the next old man with a lifetime of music would be seen before the cameras arrived to apologize too late. 10. What his music really meant began to crystallize only after the applause quieted and the headlines moved on, when the story settled into reflection rather than reaction. People returned to the video not to marvel at technique anymore, but to ask why it had affected them so deeply. Why a few minutes of piano in a public space had cut through noise and routine in ways carefully produced performances often did not. The answer was not found in novelty or surprise, but in truth. His playing carried honesty shaped by time, by having lived long enough to strip away excess and arrive at something essential. Each note held intention rather than urgency, a reminder that mastery did not shout, it spoke clearly and waited to be heard. The music exposed something uncomfortable about the way society valued art and the people who created it. It challenged the idea that talent followed linear timelines, that recognition arrived when deserved and faded when relevance ended. His presence at the piano revealed how easily depth could be overlooked when it did not arrive, wrapped in youth, spectacle, or marketing. Listeners began to understand that what moved them was not just the sound, but the context, the realization that greatness could exist quietly, uncelebrated, for decades without diminishing its power. That recognition reframed the music as testimony rather than entertainment, a living record of endurance in a world that often rewarded immediacy over substance. For musicians, the moment carried particular weight. They heard in his playing the discipline of countless hours unseen, the kind of practice that shaped instinct and expression rather than polish. They recognized choices made not to impress, but to communicate, phrasing that prioritized meaning over display. His music reminded them that technique was only a tool, and that the real work of art lay in how it connected to human experience. Many spoke of returning to their instruments with renewed humility, listening more carefully to their own sound, asking what they were truly saying rather than how they were being perceived. The broader public felt it too, even if they lacked the language to articulate why. His music became a mirror, reflecting longing, resilience, and the quiet courage of continuing without acknowledgement. It resonated with people who had felt unseen in their own lives, who recognized in his story a version of themselves waiting patiently to be recognized for who they were rather than how they appeared. The piano in the plaza became a symbol of potential missed and reclaimed, of beauty existing independent of validation, and of the danger in assuming that what was visible represented the full measure of worth. As conversations deepened, his music took on a social dimension, sparking discussions about whose voices were amplified and whose were allowed to fade. People questioned the structures that determined exposure and opportunity, acknowledging how race, age, and access shaped narratives of success. His playing did not preach or accuse, yet it prompted reflection more effectively than argument ever could. It reminded listeners that art often carried truths society resisted hearing, and that ignoring those truths came at a collective cost. For him, the meaning remained simpler. The music was what it had always been, a language he spoke fluently, a way to make sense of the world and his place within it. He did not assign it symbolic weight intentionally, but he understood why others did. He accepted that his playing had become a vessel for conversations larger than himself, and he allowed that without resentment. The piano had offered him a moment of alignment, a chance to play honestly in a space that listened, and everything that followed was an extension of that honesty rather than a departure from it. In the end, what his music really meant was not confined to that plaza or that viral video. It lived in the reminder that value did not expire with age, that depth could endure without recognition, and that listening, real listening, had the power to restore connection between people and the truths they too often pass by. His playing did not ask to be remembered, but it insisted on being felt, and in doing so, it left an imprint that extended far beyond notes and keys, shaping how people understood art, visibility, and the quiet persistence of greatness in unexpected places. When talent refuses to disappear, it does so quietly, without demanding recognition, waiting instead for a moment when the world is willing to slow down enough to receive it. The old man returned to the plaza many times after the cameras left, sometimes greeted by familiar faces, sometimes by strangers who recognized him and nodded respectfully before continuing on. The piano remained where it had always been, its surface still worn, its keys still imperfect, and he treated it the same way he always had, as a place to speak honestly rather than perform. Fame did not rewrite his habits or his values. It did not replace the years of discipline that had shaped him, or the resilience that had carried him through periods of obscurity. It simply added another layer to a life already full of meaning. What lingered most from that moment was not the recognition itself, but the reminder it offered that brilliance was not always announced by volume or visibility. His story became a quiet challenge to assumptions people made every day about age, worth, and relevance. It asked whether society was listening only for what was new and loud, or whether it could make room for voices shaped by time and experience. In classrooms, living rooms, and conversations between strangers, his image at the piano became shorthand for something deeper. The idea that greatness could sit unnoticed beside us, waiting patiently while we rush past. For him, the return to being seen did not feel like a comeback. It felt like continuity. He had never stopped being who he was, never stopped carrying music within him, and the moment in the plaza did not create his talent, it revealed it. He continued to play in small spaces and larger ones when invited, choosing settings that allowed connection rather than spectacle. He spoke sparingly in interviews, preferring to let the music do the work because that had always been enough for him. His life did not suddenly become easier or simpler, but it became more visible, and that visibility carried responsibility he accepted with humility. The legacy he left was not confined to recordings or headlines. It lived in the way people paused a little longer when they heard music drifting through a public space, in the way they looked twice at those they might have overlooked before. It lived in musicians who recommitted themselves to depth over display, and in listeners who learned to trust their emotional responses rather than dismiss them as coincidence. His story reminded the world that recognition, when it arrived late, still mattered, not as correction, but as acknowledgement. A chance to say that what had endured quietly deserved to be honored openly. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about how many lives and talents move past unnoticed each day, then take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These are the stories that remind us to listen more closely, to slow down, and to recognize that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that have been waiting the longest to be heard.